let me start with the monetary thing. We have a situation in the world today which is absolutely insane, where 97% of all the money created is created by privately owned banks. And it's all created as debt. It's all created as debt on which interest has to be paid. And yet nobody creates any money with which to pay the interest. So the only thing you can do is to borrow more and go deeper and deeper into debt. And then you get into the situation that the United States is in today, and even worse in Europe, Spain and Greece and all of those countries, because they have to go cap in hand to private bankers to get their money. When in fact, governments own the right to create money. They own the patent, and Canada or the United States could create enough money to get their economies up and running in no time flat, and all they have to do is just bring the bankers to toe and take away some of their privileges and reduce their leverage and start producing the money that would provide millions of jobs. So this has been my passion, the reason I went into politics more than 60 years ago, because I was a child of the Depression, and I never wanted to see another one. I didn't think we'd ever see anything like we have now, but we have, and it didn't need to happen. It was precipitated by Wall Street, and just like they brought on the Great Depression in 1929, because a few of the biggest banks were selling short and benefited from it, and by bringing on a depression, they put all the little banks out of, not all of them, but a lot of the little banks out of business so they could grow and have a bigger market share. And the whole banking situation worldwide is really one gigantic fraud. It's a great big Ponzi scheme whereby the banks lend the same money to 15 or 20 different people and collect interest on it from each and every one of them. Now, that's grand larceny.
Yep.
But how they get away with it, I don't know, except I do know because they have succeeded in persuading generations of kings and queens and emperors and politicians to grant them licenses and then to just let them make their own rules and go their own way. And unless and until something is done about it, the future is very bleak. It just happens to be 100 years this year since Congress sold the U.S. down the river by letting private bankers establish the Federal Reserve System, which is neither federal nor reserve, and to let them create the money supply and determine the money supply. And it was right away they recognized as one of the biggest mistakes that had ever been made, but then they didn't do anything about it. So this 100th anniversary would be the most wonderful time for the Congress to say, hey, our predecessors made a terrible mistake 100 years ago, and we're going to take back some of that power, and we're going to take over the Fed, and we're going to create enough money so that the government can balance its budget and so on without higher taxes. And that is all possible, and it's all sensible, but nobody's even talking about it, let alone doing anything about it. So I've been deeply involved for the last, many years, but my latest campaign in Canada here has been the last few months, trying to get the government to change the system and you can say print or create, it doesn't matter. Most people don't know what money is. It's just a computer entry, that's all it is. Create enough money to put the unemployed back to work and get the economy up and robust and have prosperity instead of austerity. Because Franklin Roosevelt tried austerity in the latter part of the Great Depression after having stimulated the American economy for several years and had it working fairly well. Then he had a austerity budget and set the whole thing back about 3 years, and the Great Depression lasted longer than it should have. And we're doing exactly the same thing today, which only proves that we don't learn from experience. And I think it was Einstein who said that to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results is a form of insanity.
Yeah.
So that's where we stand on that issue.
Can you explain to us, the audience, what the difference between prosperity and austerity? What more specifically what that is?
Well, absolutely. Austerity is what we have now, when we're cutting back on social services and cutting back on safety measures and cutting back on just about everything, cutting back on the number of teachers in the schoolroom and doing all of that sort of thing. And instead of a situation like we had prior to 2007, for example, when there were jobs available and when the economy was booming and when we weren't going at least as much into debt, which of course you shouldn't be going into at all at the federal level. They should create enough money to pay their own deficit, to meet their own deficit, and then to subsidize each of the states so that they wouldn't have to start borrowing money and cutting back and doing all of the things that they've been doing in the states for the last few years. It's just absolute insanity. And to let it go on and on is something that I don't know how they get away with it, but the bankers are so powerful and they have created this myth. One of the myths is that if you go into the bank to borrow money, that they lend you the money that somebody else deposited the day before. Well, that's just not true. They create it, and they create it out of thin air. And it's just a privilege. And they shouldn't have an exclusive monopoly on creating money, which they've managed to develop in the last, over really about 2.5 centuries, getting bigger and bigger slice of the pie until now they create just about all the new money that's created. And it's got to stop. I don't advertise other people's books very much, but there's one written by a lawyer there in California. It's called The Web of Debt. And I'm telling you, if you read the first 100 pages of that, you'll understand how the bankers pull the wool over the eyes of the American people and maybe have some insight into how they're still doing it.
Excellent.
I tell you, let me pop in here real quick, Brother Paul. This is Timothy Martin. I'm sort of the co-host here, but I have a question for you. Are other government officials, do they know this? In other words, because you talk to a lot of high-level officials, I would think occasionally, and do they know this scam is going on and they just ignore it, or are they actually trying to do something about it?
I think neither. I don't think they understand, and most of them are too lazy to take the time to learn about it. And consequently, if you don't understand, you don't do anything about it.
Right.
You just sort of accept, well, it's always been this way, and we go into debt, and we have to cut back, and we have to squeeze the schools and squeeze everything in austerity, which is just exactly the wrong way to go. And why people do it is because they don't know any better, I guess. And it's time they really educated themselves. What the world needs is a massive infusion of government-created money. And I don't know how much, but I would say maybe of the order of something like 20 trillion worldwide. Because under the present system, where all of the money is created like debt, by the private banks, when they have a recession like we had in 2007, 2008, the banks that created the money, when they start calling their loans, destroy money. It's just like taking a whole barrel full of $20 bills and shoveling them into the furnace. So the purchasing power, the amount of money in circulation, the purchasing power of the people goes down, and then they don't have enough money to pay for the goods and services that are being provided in the economy, and people are laid off, and you get this high unemployment. Well, then, under the present system, the only way you get out of that is to borrow more and to go deeper and deeper into debt. And that's, of course, what they're encouraging these countries in Europe to be doing today, is to keep borrowing from the banks in order to pay the banks off and pay the bonds off for the money that they've already been lent. And what we have to do is to get governments to use their power to create a lot of. In Canada, we've just made a recommendation to our government to create about $150 billion a year for 7 years and change the system and reinstate the necessity for banks to have cash reserves against their deposits, which at the present time they don't have, practically zero. And so if you multiply that by 10 for the United States, I would say that an initial government spending spree in the United States of government-created money should be of the order of $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, something of that order, because your economy is a little over 10 times as big as ours. And it is really a question of, first, as we just said, governments, leaders in the government, most of them at least, don't understand, and they take their advice from people who are deliberately misleading them, because they turn to the bankers. And one of the things I noticed as soon as the Obama government was formed, I looked at his bevy of financial advisors and said, "Oh, game over before we start," because they're the same gang that go into the Treasury and into the Fed and into one party or another, and back and perhaps from one to another. And so what they need is some fresh thinking, and there are people in the United States that really understand this thing that I'm talking about. I was talking to, or had an email from one of them today, a chap by the name of Bill Still, and he's done a series of things on money. I think the Money Masters was his.